Welcome to Farm Here Daily, a field forward podcast. I'm your host, David Geiger. Today on Farm Here Daily, while southern rust was devastating for farmers, it allowed research farms to better test fungicides. We hear from ISU Extension field crop pathologist Alison Robertson about the results of her research. Please be sure to like and follow the podcast as well as our social media at Field Forward Pod. We would love to have you join our community, keeping folks informed about what is affecting our farmers. This is Farm Here Daily. And joining me on Farm Here Daily, we are going to take a look at some of the research that has gone on in plant pathology over the last year. To do so, we have with us Alison Robertson, an Iowa State University Extension field crops pathologist with us. Alison, good to have you back on Farm Here Daily. Thanks so much for joining us ahead of the holiday new year here we're about to see. And let's just jump into it. We had this integrated crop management conference earlier this month, and you were there. You were talking about some of the research you've done. Let's just go over what that research is and talk about some of the findings you had.
Thank you, David. First of all, thanks for having me on. Secondly, at the ICM conference, I was talking about the research that I've been doing on foliar fungicides on corn. This year was a particularly good year to screen those fungicides because we had an epidemic of southern rust here in Iowa. And so during my presentation, I went over the reasons for that epidemic that we had. I strongly believe that there were 5 or 6 reasons why we had that epidemic. You know me, I always like to talk about the disease triangle, right? And so if we think about the disease triangle and we think about the host, we had susceptible hybrids out there on the landscape. So we had susceptible host. When we think about the pathogen, the southern rust pathogen cannot survive here in Iowa, and it has to get blown up here from the south. And so there are a few things that went on in the south in 2025. First of all, we had a really big increase in the number of acres that were planted to corn. If you look at the predictions from the USDA, there were up to 75% more acres in Louisiana were planted to corn in 2025 compared to 2024, and considerably more in other southern states. I remember Missouri was 10%. They were expecting 10% more acres. So we had more acres of corn down there. The other thing is that in the south, the farmers didn't spray as much as they did up here. So that just means we had a lot more inoculum getting started in the south. And then during June, July, we had a lot more winds from the south, and they were stronger than usual. And so we had all of that, just more inoculum, stronger winds, bringing that up into Iowa. And then once that inoculum got here into Iowa, we had the second wettest July on record, so extremely wet conditions, and also very, very warm conditions. So southern rust likes, to have 8 or more hours of leaf wetness for that infection. And we need to have temperatures above 75. And that's what we saw throughout July and into the beginning of August. And so that all kind of came together. And so we had a lot more southern rust than usual.
In David or layman's terms, that would be a perfect storm, essentially, is what you're getting at, is that there were just 5 different things that all needed to happen in the correct order and in the correct dosages for us to see the amount of inoculum. Could you, just real quick, sorry, tangent, could you define inoculum?
So inoculum is the spores of the fungus. So just like plants produce seeds, fungi produce spores, right? And it's the spores that land on the leaf and cause the infection.
So this inoculum, these spores, created a proper dose of poison for the plant, a proper dose of disease that then was able to spread thanks to the weather that we had in Iowa.
Yes.
And You can't overwinter here though, so
No.
it will need those same conditions to come back here again.
Yes. And what I was doing was I was comparing 2025 and 2024 because in 2024 and 2025 we saw southern rust in the middle of July, on the 16th and 18th of July. So within, 48 hours of each other, we had those first reports. And yet, yes, we saw southern rust probably more than normal in 2024, but nothing like we saw in 2025. So why was that? What was different in 2025 compared to 2024? And in 2025, we just got smoked by the disease, right? And it's because we had all these factors just coming together in this perfect storm.
So naturally, this is a very bad thing for farmers. There were a lot of reduced yields because of this. However,
Yes.
from a research standpoint, it allowed you to see disease at a much larger rate than you
Yes.
would normally be able to see it.
Oh,
So
yes.
you have fields. Iowa State University Extension has many research fields all over the state to have different doses, different areas of
Yes.
effect. Did you see this on most of those fields, and were you then able to see disease effects at a significantly better rate than you normally would?
Oh, yes. So, I mean, we had very severe southern rust at all of our locations across the state. And one of the experiments I do is I compare commercially available fungicides against each other in a trial. And so I had name brand products and then I had generic products. And the question that I was asking was, is a generic product as good as a name brand product? Thinking about the fact that a generic product is probably 4, 5, 6 times less in cost than a name brand product, right? And then even even if the generic is not as good as the name brand, well, what about if I put on 2 applications of a name brand? Of a generic, would that give me the same control as a name brand, right? And so those were the questions that I was kind of asking in this trial. And I also wanted to see, was there a name brand that stood out above the other name brands, right? In 2024, I'd seen that a couple of name brands did better than other name brand fungicides. In 2025, I didn't see any differences among the fungicides. So all of them, the generic and the name brands, all reduced the amount of southern rust. They were all very, very effective at reducing southern rust and therefore protecting that yield. Um, you know, if I remember correctly, I had yield responses of 40 to 45 bushels from that
Wow.
application of a fungicide, yes, in my trials. So a fungicide was very effective. And I should mention that these fungicides were applied at R1, right? So we wait until the corn's fully silt, and then we go in and spray. So, I like to say you want to spray between tasseling and after pollination when those silks turn brown. But we kind of go in when all those silks are out and they're nice and fresh. So, yes, I didn't see any difference among the products. At a couple of locations, the double application of that generic, which was at silking, and then 3 weeks later, did the best at those locations, but not at all of my locations, right? And
Why
so,
why do you think it is? Why do you think that was the result then? Why I can think of a couple ideas, but I'm curious to what you think about that.
well, I think first of all, I should mention that the generic that we use was a mixture of azoxystrobin and propiconazole. And I think that's very important for people to think about, right? Because we know that azoxystrobin is excellent against rust. And so serendipitously, we chose azoxystrobin and propiconazole, and we had southern rust, right? And so the generic just did outstanding. It really did well. It was as good as that name brand, and that double application, as I mentioned, was better than the name brand at some locations. And that's just because, remember, fungicides only last for a specific amount of time. So the generics are probably lasting 2 to 3 weeks. The name brands are probably lasting 4 to 5 weeks, right? And so when we put on a generic at one time, that gives us our 3 weeks. Plus, we put it on a second time, that gives us another 3 weeks. And so it just gave us, a week to 10 days longer protection than our name brand products. And so I think that's why we saw better with the 2 application of generic at 2 of my 5 locations. So
Right. And I think, naturally, there are times where it is just better to have a longer lasting product and you're not able to go every 2 to 3 weeks and do a second
exactly,
application. So there's
exactly.
going to be times where that would be better. But it's interesting to know that generics were so effective in this way. And
Yes.
the one of the initial thoughts I had was, is it because this is just such a newer not really newer, but a less common disease, so it doesn't have the tolerances or the resistances that we may see from some of the other more annual diseases in Iowa.
I think that's a great question, David. But I think azoxystrobin. We first started using azoxystrobin in the 1990s. It was very common to use azoxystrobin on inbred corn for where rust is a big problem, and azoxystrobin is just really good about rust. And I really good on rust, and we haven't really developed any resistance to that azoxystrobin with southern rust or even common rust, right? And so I think it's just a fact that we used azoxystrobin, and we had rust. If we had used the azoxystrobin plus propiconazole and had tar spot or northern corn leaf blight or gray leaf spot, we might have had completely different results, right? And so I think that's important for people to realize, is that it just so happened that we had an excellent product. If you go to the Crop Protection Network, right, azoxystrobin is rated excellent against southern rust. So whereas it's very good against tar spot so we just lucked out. We just had the azoxy and we had the southern rust.
Right.
So yeah, that it's so we need to be careful, right? When we're interpreting these results, we need to think about, what did we use and what disease was prevalent.
What was the control genetics like for these corn plants?
We had some very susceptible genetics. So at a couple of my locations, we planted a hybrid that we knew was susceptible to tar spot. Turned out that hybrid was also pretty susceptible to southern rust as well. So yeah, and most of my locations, the hybrids that I had was pretty susceptible to southern rust. So I did have one trial that I didn't show results for at ICM, where that hybrid just was amazingly resistant to southern rust, and we got no southern rust. It
Really?
was
Wow.
really boring from my point of view, right? But yeah, so
Interesting.
yeah, yeah,
That's super interesting because it makes sense that you would want to have a susceptible one, because the point is not necessarily to test the corn. You're testing the response to fungicides. And
yes,
that's what you said at the
exactly,
beginning. That was the point of your research. You just
yes,
also happened to have a year where southern rust
yep,
was extremely prevalent, and you can't
yep.
plan for that. What was the takeaway then when you got all the data, when you took it back to the lab, went through it, and then brought it to ICM? What was the pronouncement to make from it?
So the pronouncement that I made was, first of all, there was no difference among the fungicides, right? They all protected yields. No one product stood out against another product. So they were all equally effective. They all protected that yield. But I'm a firm believer in that for every input, there should be an output, right? And so some of the data I showed from at the ICM was, I wanted folks to think about return on investment, right? And so that was another thing that I brought up is, and I used data from the Crop Protection Network. they have a return on investment, an ROI calculator. And so the way that works is every year, Crop Protection Network asks us to collect prices for fungicides from across our state. And so I usually ask the ISU field agronomist for those numbers, and then I send those numbers into CPN, and they come up with an average price for that product across the US, right? And so those are the prices that I use. And then for a generic, I just got hold of a few folks that I know, and I got a generic price from them, right? And kind of came up with an average and asked if they agreed. And so, and I mean, it doesn't take, you don't have to realize, right, that a generic is so much less, costs so much less than a name brand fungicide. And so obviously the best return on investment came with that generic fungicide. And so that was the other point, that although there was no difference among the products, you got the best return on investment with that generic. But like, once again, I want to remind folks, right, that we used azoxystrobin, which is excellent against southern rust, which was the prevalent disease. And so if it had been tar spot, we might not have seen as good a return on investment with our generic, right, compared to our name brands. So, yep, it was that was kind of my take-home message, right, was a foliar fungicide is a good way to manage foliar disease if it becomes a problem during the growing season. And one of the things that folks should be thinking about is, first of all, what is the foliar disease they have? Then consulting the Crop Protection Network to see which fungicide would be most effective against that foliar disease. And then thinking about return on investment, right? How much are they willing to pay for that application? And what are they expecting their yield response to be? And are they going to get bang for their buck?
I appreciate your very balanced perspective there, because it can be true that in this case, in this instance, generics were just better because of price, right?
Yes.
That can be true. And it can also be true that on some fields it wasn't, and in some years it won't be. And for certain diseases it just isn't designed for. And so when you take all of that into account, you have this result of, now we know it can be more effective to use basically what was the
azoxystrobin.
Azoxystrobin. We can have azoxystrobin be extremely effective against rust, and we know that it's effective against rust. So in the future, if that happens again, you might, and you have the ability and capabilities of doing 2 passes, that might be a better option, which is the cool part about this science, right? That's not going to be what you plan for every year, because we certainly hope we don't have southern rust in this extremes again. But next time you might be able to say, hey, let's save this product for the fields that need it. And because we know that this is extremely effective, we can just do this.
Yes, exactly. Yep.
So let's just take a look at a disease perspective for 2025 then, as we move into 2026. You mentioned it's unlikely to have southern rust as it happened this year, because we had the perfect conditions, the perfect storm.
Yep.
But what is the state of disease? When you look at the soils, when you look at the other disease pressures we saw this year, what are some of the expectations for that overwintering and what we are going to see heading into spring?
So we had tar spot this year. We also had a fair amount of northern corn leaf blight, probably because we had those very wet conditions. I was surprised that we did not have a lot of gray leaf spot. And then we also found a new disease at a couple of locations in Iowa, curvularia leaf spot. So, as I look ahead to 2026, southern rust, start with a clean slate, no inoculum in Iowa. Tar spot, northern corn leaf blight, probably a little bit more inoculum sitting there just because we saw both of those diseases this year. Gray leaf spot, I would say we're a little bit down on inoculum because we didn't have a lot of that this year. And so we don't have a lot of that fungus surviving in the residue. And then curvularia, I'm pretty sure it survives, but I'm a scientist, right? I need to have data to that proof that it does survive. And so we're collaborating with several folks across the US, and we have data. We have residue at the moment out on a couple of farms in Iowa, just on the surface, buried underneath the surface, and we'll be collecting that in spring and then seeing whether we can get the spores off of that residue and whether those spores can then infect corn. So I mean, as I go into 2026, I think, tar spot, northern corn leaf blight, that would be at the top of my list, just in terms because we have the most inoculum. Southern rust, still a concern because we have that increase in acres down in the south, and from what I've heard, it's probably going to be even more acres planted to corn in 2026 just because the cotton prices are so bad. So that just means potentially more inoculum. But yeah, I mean, the big thing is, are we going to have the second wettest July on record in 2026 again? I don't know. I may be eating my hat this time next year.
Let's cross our fingers that we aren't going to see that.
Yeah.
Well, Alison, those were my main questions I have for today, but because thankfully this is a podcast and I can just ask more questions or less questions as I see fit, I want to just ask a question and maybe we take it off, maybe we leave it, but as kind of like a David's Learn thing, I try not to ask too many of these questions because I don't like to appear super dumb or ignorant, but I mean, I'm not an expert in most of these fields, so I normally ask them off record. So,
yeah.
But in this case, I am interested to just, because it was picking my brain. You're talking about the inoculum, and you're talking about how it was in higher doses, higher concentrations than usual, and I was thinking of spores, and then I was thinking of kind of other things that work that way, right? The dose makes the poison. You have venom and poisons that exist that can be medicine and they can be deadly. Is that true? Is that the same thing when it comes to fungal infections and fungal diseases where it takes a certain amount of parts per million in the air to actually infect things? Or is it just that helps get it infected because there's just more opportunities for it to take place?
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question. I love that question because there's a lot of technology out there at the moment where people are detecting spores in the air, right? Detecting spores in the, or amounts of pathogen in the soil, and then using that to kind of come up with a disease risk. And I think the most important thing when you're thinking about, I think you can do that with some things, right? But you cannot do that with plant diseases because that environment side of the triangle is so important. And I've been at Iowa State 21 years now, right? And I can remember. Oh, thank you. Well, they gave me tenure. They can't get rid of me now. So at least that's what I say. But so the one thing that I learned in the first few years that I was in Iowa was, being an extension, I tried to get diseases to develop in the field, right? Because I wanted to be able to teach people, this is what gray leaf spot looks like, this is what northern corn leaf blight looks like, etc. And we would go out there, I like to say, with bucket loads of spores, right? And if, just like so much inoculum. And we would just dump it onto these susceptible corn hybrids and we wouldn't get disease. And
really?
the reason why we wouldn't get disease is because we didn't have the right conditions. We didn't keep the leaves wet for long enough, or we didn't have enough humidity, or whatever the case may be. And so, like I said, that's a great question that you asked. So it's my opinion that you can have 100 spores, you can get have 10,000 spores. There's not necessarily going to be a difference in the amount of disease, because it's going to come down to that environment. But I agree with you that if you have 10,000 spores versus 100 spores, you have more opportunity, right, for the disease to come in. But really, I think that, again, in my opinion, so many people underestimate that environmental side of the triangle. And that has to be there. Otherwise, we don't get a full triangle, and therefore we don't get disease.
I really appreciate that, because now my head's going more in the direction of where it probably should go, since fungus is a living organism that is similar, not the same as plants. It makes me think more of like seeds, where certain plants will spread hundreds of thousands of seeds, and most of them aren't ever going to grow into a plant. It's just, it has to be in the right spot with the correct amount of moisture and the correct amount of nutrients for it to grow. It can grow in the middle of a sidewalk, and it won't grow in the middle of a field. And there's really no rhyme or reason except for what you said, the environmental effects.
Yeah. That's I've never ever thought of it like that, and that's absolutely true. Yep. Yes. Bang on. Yeah.
Well, I got to learn something today, so thank you so much. Alison Robertson is an extension field crops pathologist with Iowa State University. Alison, it was truly a pleasure being able to talk to you today on Farm Your Daily.
Thanks for having me, David. Happy New Year and all the best for 2026.
This is Farm Here Daily, a Field Forward podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Again, in order to continue to produce this type of local content, we would love to have you join our community. So please follow the podcast as well as our social media channels at Field Forward Pod. You can also find me on social media at Geiger Reports. Again, I am your host, David Geiger, and I'll be back again tomorrow, everybody.